Panzer Dragoon Remake on the Switch. Yes, that's the version we'll be reviewing today, and I'm just gonna get this out of the way. I did not like this. So let's get into it, and I'll try not to go too hard on it. Panzer Dragoon Remake is a full remake of the original Panzer Dragoon on the Sega Saturn in 1995, and at that time this was a very impressive looking game, especially when you put into perspective that 3D rendered games were still in its infancy and really rare. And with that perspective, you can understand how someone could forgive the shortcomings of this game being an hour long and having rather slow gameplay for a non-rails shooter. But in 2021, if you're deciding to remake this game, these are things you should probably address, and spoilers, they're not. So this time around, I want to start talking about what was remastered, the graphics, because it doesn't look good. Yeah, I played the Switch version, which is probably the worst looking port, but I have looked at the PC version, and while textures have much higher looking resolutions and the lighting looks better, which is honestly one of my biggest problems with this game, it's still a fairly bland looking game. And why is that? Well, first I want to address the biggest issue for me, that is the lighting. There is no way around it. This game is orange. I mean overall orange, and this would be fine as an aesthetic choice if it added to the look of the game, making it more moody in some way or just making it look more believable, but it doesn't. In fact, I found that it removes a lot of detail. The best example for me is in episode 2 that takes place mostly under the trees, and in the original game there is a big difference in the lighting as you exit the darkness of the caves and enter the open and exposed desert as it leads to the boss fight. But in the remake, well, it's just all well lit and orange, losing a lot of the impact of the level because everything just blends in together. This is also a problem for the gameplay, but more on that later. It would be disingenuous for me to say that this looks worse than the original in a pure technical way, but what I can say is when you're remaking a game that its big draw was the graphics and remaking it for a new generation of people, why make it look 2 generations old? Not so much for the PC version, which has some niceties that just couldn't be done back then, but the Switch version is borderline a PS2 game, which really brings up why remake it if you're going to make it look so subpar. My only guess is that this project was rushed or cut funding, but that's not my place to judge. What I'm here to judge is the game that came out, specifically the Switch port. Before we move on to the gameplay, I want to mention the story, which is very connected to the graphics as the cutscenes for the most part are shot for shot remakes, except a whole less dynamic, and the result is horrible. It looks so awkward. It ends up looking worse than the original. Legitimately, as once again the original game did a really good job selling the darkness and size of the world. Meanwhile, everything about the remake is just so awkward, and human characters look uncanny. And in its search to recreate the original pre-rendered scenes with the in-game engine here, it ends up creating problems that probably didn't exist in the original game 25 years ago. Things like creatures that run through the earth and the game just not having convincing animations for that, or camera angles that are way too up close, probably because the original game didn't have to worry about the camera clipping through the scenery to make the shot. These are only guesses, of course, but this one I can say for certainty that the original looks better. And this ends up being a deterrent for the plot. This is an hour-long game and I did not care to dive into its lore. I can tell there was some war going on in this world and that Dragoon is like a big deal and he can help end it, I don't know. This might be completely wrong, but those horrible cutscenes did not help my interest. Regardless, now moving on to the gameplay. Panzer Dragoon is an on-rails shooter with its unique feature or gimmick being, well, first that it is a 3D game that you can rotate 360 degrees, changing between 4 perspectives, 2 side ones being what you perceive as left and right, where you can only aim and a front and back view where you not only aim but also move your Dragoon, having to actually move your Dragoon to aim rather than the traditional aim and movement being independent. And it is a nice novelty and it adds some strategy, and it's also unique for the genre, even if I think it can be a bit too slow. Then moving on to the two attacks you have, the regular attack where it just shoots where you aim, and the lock-on attack that, well, locks on to multiple targets at once by just hovering your aim over them. The thing is, there is only two attacks, and the lock-on attack makes the regular attack useless, because one thing the regular attack should have over the lock-on, being speed or fire rate, is completely overshadowed by how much more damage the lock-on one does, especially against bosses that can be locked on multiple times in a single attack. And the thing is, during a lock-on attack, you can still move, giving it a huge advantage against that regular attack. The only situation where the regular would be superior would be to fight a larger amount of smaller one-hit enemies, but with the seriously OP amount of times you can lock on, and the low amount of times that these situations arrive, really means you will most likely lock on your way through the game, which is not the worst thing ever, just a bit weird and disappointing. Speaking of enemies, there are primarily two types of enemies. The ones that fly at you, meaning you have to kill or avoid them, preferably kill because you want to get that extra lives at the end of the level, and the projectile throwing enemies, which you can guess what they do. The most fun and dynamic you will find here is the bosses and mini bosses, as usually they are big and have of course larger health bars, and you have to manage them and their projectiles while also dealing with the smaller enemies. But because of the slow nature of the game, this can also never get too complicated. But overall, I think the enemies are fine. The gameplay overall is fine. There isn't a whole variety of them, but the game is also really short, which is what we're gonna talk about now. This game is 7 episodes long, and you can beat each episode in about 5 to 10 minutes. So beating the whole game can take less than an hour, which, like I said, because of the graphics back then and expectations back then for how long games should last, this was probably okay in 1995, especially since the graphics probably looked insane. But in current year, expectations are a bit different, especially for the retail price of $25, and it's really what you see is what you get here. There are no extra levels or modes. It's really a bare game, and because of how slow the nature of the game is, stuff like score attacks and playing on harder difficulties just did not appeal to me at all. To try and circumvent this, of course, the game pulls the oldest trick in the book, which is artificial difficulty. On normal and hard, extra lives are giving out sparingly, and your health doesn't fully restore between episodes. And guess what happens when you lose all your lives? It's back to the beginning. It's designed like an arcade game, which again might have been fine in 1995, but in my personal opinion, it's not fine now. Lastly, I'll talk about the soundtrack, so I can finally finish this off. My overall opinion on the music is that it's fine. When playing the game it sounded fine and I had no problem, but when listening to it next to the original, once again it feels not so much like a downgrade, but as a step sideways. It sounds more orchestral now, but it also lost a lot of the high-pitched and odd sounds that gave off the feeling of this lived-in weird world. And while these sounds are still here, now they're too muted, in such a way that what was once a very unique sounding game is now a very generic sounding one, in my opinion. And that's the thing with this game. It doesn't stand out in any way. If you're remaking a game, you have to stand out in some way, or why bother? Or at least be faithful to the original, and I feel like this remake fails at both. It is not the worst game I've ever played by a far margin, but to me it feels like it lacks a reason to exist. And for these reasons, I'm giving Panzer Dragoon Remaster on the Switch a 3 out of 10. And well, without playing the PC version, I would say that probably that one would be a little bit higher simply because of the graphics actually being remasters, but as it sits here on the Switch, I would much rather have a port of the original game, since that one can actually be somewhat hard to find at a decent price. As far as recommendations go, don't buy it. I don't want to assume this is a soulless remake made purely to revive or check interest in the series, but I'm definitely thinking it. If you must though, I would say play the PC version, but please don't buy this game for $25. 5 or less is the way to go, as this game gets discounted a lot for obvious reasons. I mean, for $25 you could literally play an actual coin-sucking arcade game for longer. Regardless, I know despite me saying I would try and not go too hard on this game that I did, and honestly I don't hate this game, but it did leave a sour taste in my mouth, and I'm a bit tired of poor remakes that commit the worst sin possible, which is lose what made the original special. Regardless though, I know I have the controversial opinion on this game, but I still hope it helped you make your decision regardless of what that decision is. And I hope you consider subscribing and even leaving a like and comment, all things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day and goodbye.